Good afternoon, participants. Good afternoon to all who have joined this first session of lecture series on Gandhiji as designer, hosted by Symbiosis, Institute of Design, and Shastri, Indo-Canadian Institute. I'm Dr. Nitin Hadap, Fashion Design Department Head at Symbiosis Institute of Design, Pune. I'm delighted that Professor Emma Tarlo is our first guest speaker in this lecture series. SID is keen to cultivate at least some aspect of Gandhiji's philosophy in the context of visual culture into the young generation. This lecture series will add a new aspect about Gandhiji in the mind of young generation working in the field of visual art and design. We are also exploring possibility of seeing Gandhiji from a different perspective. Now, let me invite Dr. Prachi Kaul, Director, Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute, New Delhi, for opening remark. Over to you, Dr. Prachi.
Thank you. Very good afternoon, everyone present here. Emma, for agreeing to be present for this lecture here today, and eminent scholars who are present to be part of this event. Shastri's Institute is extremely proud to support this lecture on moral fiber, Gandhi, Khadi, and the invention of national dress. I'm no expert, of course, but as for my understanding and information goes, in India itself, a lot of research, as one of the professor was sharing, that a lot of research and studies and work have been done in the past 50 years by our own Indian scholars, and of course by those scholars abroad as well. And that has made great contribution in a way to carry forward the agenda Gandhiji started. In our different ways, and different perspective have been built up by all these scholars to build up this agenda that he has initiated at his time. To me, journey of Khadi, ever since I have remembered, Khadi have been integral part of my growing up. I especially chose to wear Khadi today because it was to celebrate this particular fabric, which has long history and I would say a kind of national movement behind it. So journey of Khadi for sure has seen many, many struggles for maintaining a balance between, what is tradition and what is modern. So it links both tradition and modernity very well. And thanks to institutions like NID, SEPT, and of course MAHE that have contributed immensely in terms of taking Khadi to new horizons and exploring it and bringing it to the young generation of ours so that they can explore and understand the weaving of Khadi, not just as a fabric, but also weaving in terms of the concept and the notion that is weaved with it. So I think maintaining a balance between modernity and tradition was something that Bapuji has taught us. And so discussing this contribution would be very, very interesting today. And I'm certainly aware that our member institutions with expertise in design like SEPT or NID, and I welcome your institute as well, Nitinji, that have done some acclaimed work in this area, including Dr. Balram, of course. And I'm sure Professor Emma Tarlo's talk will certainly bring some fresh perspective to the idea and the term as a Gandhi as designer that we have placed here for today's talk. Those who are not aware of Shastri Institute, I would just like to say that it's a binational organization. We are mandated by both the Government of India through Ministry of Education and Government of Canada through Global Affairs Canada. And our mandate is to build academic and cultural relations between India and Canada by undertaking programs and providing services that facilitate and sustain binational dialogue, understanding and interactions as well. And these relationships, encompass both institutional as well as individual linkages. So we are kind of a platform which provides you an opportunity to network and collaborate amongst 157 plus institutions from India and Canada. You name a good institution, it is part of our network, and we feel very proud on facilitating exchange on this binational corridor. So for over five decades, we celebrated our Golden Jubilee in 2018. And especially this lecture is under Golden Jubilee Celebration Scheme. And this is the last program under which we have, these grants have been made. So with this program, we are winding up our Golden Jubilee celebrations actually. And that's why it is all the more very, very important. So for over 5 decades, we have been promoting binational understanding and cooperation. And this is the only binational organization which provides collaborative research programs, academic exchanges, and other partnership and network building support to Canadian and Indian institutions of higher learning. A very important feature of Shastri's support is that Shastri program often provides seed grant, allowing faculty and researchers to start up with their international research collaboration between India and Canada. And upon completion of their initial collaborative project, nearly, I would say 95% of these grantees are able to secure major funding from other agencies to leverage and multiply kind of collaboration that they envisage out of these projects. As a result, I would say Shastri's program, binational research teams in India and Canada, universities have engaged in wonderful collaborative projects in all domain of studies, whether it was humanities and social sciences, communication, economics, education, ecology, or it is STEM areas, which includes all development studies, empowerment, women, children, food security, sustainable development, everything. You name an area, we have an intervention there. So I would say this is kind of an initiative from our side by which we try to engage with Gandhian philosophy, art, culture, and of course the science that he has placed forward to the world community. So I am very, very delighted that I am here today with all of you. And once again, Nitinji, congratulations to you and your organizing team for putting up this event together. And I'm sure this is going to bring some delight to our ears for the people who are present here and those who are listening to it as young researchers and students, because it is important that these notions, these ideas, these ideologies are passed on to the younger generation, and they are able to sustain and maintain the thoughts that Gandhiji started. So congratulations once again. I wish you the best for this lecture and many more lectures that would come in this series. Thank you so much, and all the best.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am, for opening remarks and supported this lecture series with award of SICI Golden Jubilee Lecture Series grant. I'd like to address you, ma'am. This year, even Symbiosis International University is also celebrating our Golden Jubilee year.
Oh, congratulations.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
So our topic today is Gandhiji as designer, Gandhiji's approaches and impact on visual art, design and visual culture of India. Under this lecture series, we have Professor Emma Tarlo with us. Her topic is Moral Fiber, Gandhiji, Khadi and Invention of National Dress. Before I invite Professor Tarlo to address all of our students, faculty members and guests, I'd like to introduce her to all of you. Professor Emma Tarlo is currently a professor and director of research, Department of Anthropology, Goldsmith, University of London. Emma Tarlo has conducted long-term anthropological fieldwork in India, Britain, as well as short fieldworks in China, Myanmar, and USA. She specialized in anthropology of material culture, and her areas are mostly with the reference of dresses, fashion, textile, the body of hair in transcultural context. She is also interested in urban anthropology and relationship between history and anthropology. Her work engages with issues of colonialism, nationalism, identities, ethnicities, aesthetics, memory, religious, revivalism, stigma, creativity, and question of representation, and materiality. She is particularly interested in the relationship between visual material and narrative forms and in developing new models of ethnographical writing and exhibition making. That is what her specialty, I believe. She is writing books simultaneously. She is exhibiting shows and exhibitions. Much of Emma Tarlo's work focus on the body of cultural artifacts and on the role played by dress in society, politics, cultural relationship, religious and aesthetics life in India and Britain. Her book, Clothing Matters, explored the decisive role played by dress in asserted and maintenance of colonial authority in late 19th century India and in the development and spread by Gandhian inspired nationalism in 1920s and 30s. It also examined how tensions concerning gender, caste, class, and religious continued to be played or thought about dress in rural and urban India in the late 80s and even early 90s when she was conducting fieldwork in India. Emma's latest research of dress focus on the growth of visible Muslim dress in Britain, Europe, and on the engagement of Islamic and modest fashion. Emma Tarlo's book, Engagement, The Secret Life of Hair, is currently being translated into Chinese and Korean. Last but not the least, Emma has 3 books, 4 edited books, 30 plus research paper, and 2 exhibitions in her credit. With that introduction, may I now request Professor Emma Tarlo to address all of us. Thank you so much, Professor Tarlo. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Nitin, and thank you to all of you for inviting me, both the Symbiosis Institute and the Shastri Institute. It really is a huge pleasure and an honor, actually, to be invited to participate in this series. And I feel suitably humbled because I'm very aware that many of the people in the audience will also have an enormously rich knowledge and experiences in relation to Khadi. But I'm also very happy to be speaking to students because it was actually when I was a student myself, a PhD student working in India, that I became absolutely fascinated by the incredible writing, thinking, and thought processes of Mahatma Gandhi in relation to Khadi and national identity and so on. And it was at that time that I did a lot of research in this area. So it also takes me back to my student days to be thinking about that. And I'm particularly delighted to be thinking about Gandhiji as a designer, because I find it such a fruitful way for thinking about the kind of monumental role that he played, not only in designing a suitable dress for the freedom movement, and I'm thinking of the sort of Khadi uniform and the Gandhi topi that became so popular and that Jawaharlal Nehru referred to as, you know, the livery of freedom, but also for rethinking about what design might or should be about. And I think that's where Gandhi is so interesting. And in doing so, in redefining aesthetic codes and values in India and reconnecting aesthetic priorities not only to the very urgent, you know, political needs of the day, but also, and equally importantly, to wider social, moral, psychological, economic, and environmental concerns. So he was an incredibly broad thinking person. And I'm going to share my PowerPoint with you straight away as I speak. So let's just open it up now. Let's go on to it here. Can you see this PowerPoint?
Yes, it's visible.
Very good. Yeah, yeah. So Gandhi, in many ways, I would say, invented the concept of social design long before this term became popularized in the United States. And design, viewed in this light, is concerned not just with products, but very much with processes. And it's less about building individual reputation of designers than it is about building socially responsible relationships of production and consumption. And it's driven less by market forces than by perceptions of human needs and environmental concerns. And it's for this reason that I find it particularly interesting to be thinking about Gandhi's role as a designer in 2021, over a century after he embarked on popularizing khadi as national dress. Because we find ourselves at a historical juncture where many of the issues that were core to Gandhi's thinking have emerged as key priorities of our time and are recognized as such very much at a global level. So I'm thinking about the importance of decolonizing minds and bodies, where decolonization is understood not just as a moment, but actually as an ongoing process. The concern with environmental sustainability, and we can think about this sort of penetrating critique of the fashion industry, particularly fast fashion, with its devastating effects on carbon emissions and water consumption and water pollution. The importance of valuing local natural resources and labor, something that the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted so clearly, making us all recognize the vital importance of local networks and interdependencies for goods and services. And this is something I've seen very much in London, this sort of building of local community that has actually developed in this moment. And the need not only for poverty alleviation, but also for a reconceptualization of what wealth is. What do we understand by wealth? With less emphasis on material accumulation and more emphasis on broader concepts of human and environmental well-being. And so a lot of these ideas nowadays are being talked about in terms of the concept of degrowth economics, but which Gandhi in many ways addressed through such notions as sarvodaya, or universal upliftment, and through his own embrace of voluntary poverty or simplicity. So the exciting challenge of looking back at Gandhi's role in designing a national dress and aesthetic, and in the first few decades of the 20th century, is that it simultaneously provides us with the opportunity to look forward and to think about how his legacy might help us find solutions to some of the most pressing challenges of our present and our future. So what I want to do in this lecture then is to take you right back to Gandhi's emergence as a designer, taking in a sense a sort of kaleidoscopic and necessarily rapid look at the ingenious ways in which he wove together social, moral, economic, and political concerns, and he used design as a central tool for addressing these issues. And I am, of course, well aware that the overall story that I'm about to recount will be highly familiar to many of you, but I suspect that for some, it may be so familiar that some of the details may have faded out of view, perhaps leaving mere images, images of crowds of khadi-clad freedom fighters united in white, incredible images, in fact, or of Gandhi himself in his dhoti or languti, often worn with a shawl, an image that's so familiar and so distinctive, that it even features in computer games. This is the game Civilization. And I think it's very easy when we look back at familiar images to imbue them with nostalgia, and we might think, well, of course the crowds in the 1920s and 30s were wearing white khadi, that was the uniform of non-cooperation, that was the uniform of civil disobedience, that was the uniform of the day. But there was absolutely nothing inevitable about this uniform. Neither was there anything inevitable about Gandhi's own appearance, which constituted a radical break with the dress of the educated Indian men of his era. So to perceive such clothes as kind of old-fashioned or traditional, as young people might today, is to dismiss the radical nature of Gandhi's social experiments in design. So what I want to do today is to take you back, insofar as I can, into the very sort of mindset of Gandhi's design thinking, and to try to unpack how he wove together social, moral, economic, psychological, and political concerns in his attempt to redefine aesthetic values and to build, both literally and metaphorically, the moral fiber of the nation through his promotion of khadi cloth. Now, getting into Gandhi's mindset may sound an extremely presumptuous idea, especially proposed by an English woman sitting in London, for which I apologize for all of those things. But my only defense is that the journey I propose into Gandhi's thought processes is led entirely by Gandhi himself, and the very close readings that I have tried to make of his own work, which I began doing as a student, as I say. The collected works of Mahatma Gandhi consist of some 100 volumes, filled not only with his political writings and speeches, but with letters and thoughts and jottings, which have been all very painstakingly collated. And taken alongside the many accounts written by his close followers and other commentators of the day, they offer an extraordinary insight into his reasoning. And it's really unusual, actually, to have so much insight into somebody's reasoning and way of dealing with problems and finding solutions. And what I hope is that this exercise of revisiting how he thought as a designer might be helpful to some of the next generation of students, next generation of designers, as you tackle some of the local and global challenges of today and indeed of the future. So what I'm going to do in this talk then is basically three things. First, to look at the political, economic and aesthetic background behind Gandhi's choice of khadi, that is hand-woven cloth made from hand-spun yarn, and the spinning element is crucial here. How that became a national symbol and why was cloth so important to him, and why this plain homespun cloth in particular. Then I want to explore his own personal experiments with cloth and clothes and the complexity of his design thinking as he set about trying to invent a national dress for India, in many ways transforming the visual culture of his day in quite substantial ways. And finally, to explore briefly in the time we have left, some of these aspects of this, the moral legacy of this social thinking around design, and to take a very brief look at some of the ways that this is being taken up in different ways in India today, although I'm sure many people in the audience would be much better experts on that than I am. So firstly, the question I want to address then is how and why did cloth and clothes become so important to Gandhi, so absolutely central to his thinking and activities? And to understand this, I think we need to see how Gandhi grew to perceive the negative effects of the colonial presence in India, not just in terms of politics and economy, but also in terms of psychology and well-being. And one of the most invasive aspects of colonialism was, he felt, the more or less subtle colonization of mind and body that took place when colonial values and tastes were imbibed and reproduced by educated Indians, who he felt became disconnected from their own culture and heritage. And dress, sometimes described as our social skin for the extraordinary place it stands in, the position it occupies on the border between the body and the social self. Dress seemed to be almost like a barometer of this process of the colonization of body and minds. So by the late 19th and early 20th century, a number of men from elite families in India had begun to adopt European suits. And this is an image of a Parsi family. Others were adding appendages of Western dress in the form of boots and shoes and tailored jackets and watches and umbrellas and so forth. Even those who continued to wear Indian styles often tempered them to European tastes. So elaborate turbans got sort of simpler and more sort of fixed in form, were often replaced by ready-made headgear. Long sherwanis got tighter and shorter. Flowing fabrics gave way to increasingly rigid cloth, often in dark colors, particularly for men, while previously simple necklines started sort of sprouting collars. And changes were also taking place in elite women's dress. You know, lacy Victorian blouses, as you can see here, began to be worn under the sari. Chunky jewelry became smaller and more muted. And previously naked or slippered feet became forced into stockings and shoes, which were quite oppressive in the climate. And attitudes to these changes varied. So on the one hand, European dress was associated by many with sophistication, modernity, and progress, because these were the kind of values that the British colonial people were promoting. So as the dress of the colonizer, it was accepted by some from the elite classes as a kind of material embodiment and proof of civilization. It was seen that you were civilized and you were modern if you wore such clothes. But on the other hand, some people felt that to wear such clothes was also like a kind of desertion of family, caste, or community. And it was perceived by some to be, you know, alienating and impure. And this situation was made more complicated by the hypocrisy and ambivalence of British attitudes. So whilst on the one hand, the British sometimes looked down on garments such as dhotis and saris worn without blouses, because they saw them as sort of scanty and uncivilized, and they were keen to reclothe people in mill cloth that was manufactured in their own factories. On the other hand, they discouraged what was considered imitation of the West, and this phrase was used a lot. And they were often disparaging about the hybrid outfits that were becoming popular amongst some educated people at the time. So these are caricatures that were taken from a magazine known as the Indian Charivari, which later became the Hindi Punch. These were drawn in 1873, but you can see this kind of mocking of these combinations that were emerging. And the impossibility and humiliation of this situation was brilliantly captured in the drawings of the Bengali artist Gaganendranath Tagore. And I think he made these drawings in around 1917. Now you can't see here, but written in pencil at the bottom of this page, it reads, "By the sweat of my brow, I tried to be mistaken for a sahib, but that man still calls me Babu." And it's a critique of British racism, but it's also a critique of the futility of Indian desires to be accepted on British terms. And it is also, of course, a statement on the extreme unsuitability of a three-piece black suit in the Indian climate. So you can see the sweat. It's not just a psychological sweat, but it's a physical sweat. In another drawing, he captures the schizophrenic moment of a man being caught in the act of changing into Western clothes, probably with a view to being able to remain in a first-class railway carriage, because this was a sort of criteria, you know, of civilization and being eligible. And the caption reads, "Don't disturb me now, I'm about to become a sahib." But it's capturing the kind of absurdity and humiliation of the situation. And Gandhiji was brought up in the full thrust of these very dilemmas, and he was extremely sensitive to them. So as a child brought up in Gujarat, he was somewhat removed from contact with the British, but he nonetheless wore sort of Europeanized forms of Indian dress. And you can see him age 7 on the left, and in the other picture, he's age 17. He's the one sitting on the left. He's age 17 in 1886. And we can see how he's retained Indian forms of headwear being a primary focus of social and religious identity for men. But his dress is highly tailored. You can see this kind of button down, dark colors, the collar, and so on. So that even if it's sort of an Indian style, it's been very much catering to Western tastes. And you can see the sort of chain, watch and chain of his, I think, his brother pictured alongside him. So when at the age of 19, Gandhi set sail for London to study law, he was extremely anxious, he writes, to fit in, and he adopted European attire, including a European haircut, so as, he says, not to look barbarian in the eyes of Englishmen. And of course, I'm sure you're all absolutely familiar with this image of Gandhi, how he looked when he was studying in London between 1888 and 1891, where he describes in his autobiography that he did his very best to become an English gentleman, taking French lessons, elocution lessons, violin lessons, although he never left his vegetarianism. But it's very clear from his writings that at this stage in life, he too believed in the civilizing effects of European dress. And he even forced his wife and children to adopt socks and shoes and stockings on his return to Gujarat, much to his wife Kasturba's annoyance at the time. So it was only when he moved to South Africa, where he lived and worked as a lawyer and human rights activist for 20 years, that he began to grow disillusioned with the power of European dress to embody civilized values. For he learnt through bitter experience that racism went beyond clothes. Not only was he asked to remove his headwear in court, which was extremely humiliating, but he also found that in spite of his European dress, he was still thrown out of a first-class railway carriage, an incident which shocked him considerably and that he acknowledges as having had a formative impact on his ideas and thinking. So as someone who had himself abandoned Indian dress in favor of European styles, Gandhi understood what sartorial anxiety and humiliation felt like at quite a visceral level. And he began to reason that if India were to free itself of colonial rule, it needed a new set of clothes, a new social skin in which to do so. So two ideas came together in his thinking. The idea that he could publicly expose Indian suffering and humiliation through the adoption of Indian styles. And here we see a picture of him dressed as a poor laborer in Durban in 1914 in a protest against the shooting of Indian coal miners. And it's interesting because it's the first time that he wears simple Indian styles and simple plain white clothes in a public protest. And he associates them with mourning. And this theme of mourning returns when he goes down to adopting a dhoti or loincloth. He talks about it as a dress of mourning in some ways. And he combines this with the idea that to revive hand weaving, he could set about solving India's economic crisis and promoting self-sufficiency and human dignity. And it's important to remember that whilst he was living in South Africa, he lived a lot of the time in communal settlements with men and women from different backgrounds, many of them Christian, who were interested not only in civil rights, but in searching for an alternative lifestyle characterized by simplicity and self-sufficiency. So they were experimenting with crime, they were experimenting self-sufficiency and making things and sense of learning independence in quite interesting ways. And already when he was in South Africa, he began experimenting with weaving. He was very aware of what was happening in India. So why weaving? Because he recognized that British colonial trading policies had had a devastating effect on India's textile economy. So one of the key issues at stake, as I'm sure you're all aware, was cotton. Cotton was one of the most important natural resources. And before the invention of mill technology, India had been a very powerful producer of cotton goods. So much so that in the early 18th century, the British had even banned the import and wearing of cotton goods in an attempt to protect British industry from competition from India. However, with the invention of the spinning jenny and the spread of mill technology in Europe and in India, this situation became radically reversed. And here we can see a picture of a spinning mill outside Preston in Lancashire in 1834. And you can imagine the absolute speed with which cotton is spun with such technology. So by the early 20th century, India had transformed from the world's most advanced supplier of sophisticated cotton goods that really were the envy of the world, to becoming primary an exporter of raw cotton and an importer of mill cloth, specially woven and printed to suit Indian tastes, and for which they were charged excise duties. So suddenly all the value and profit is going to foreign countries and not to India. And here we can see inside a British factory at that time. Now, the British entrepreneurs were highly explicit in their attempts to capture the Indian market for cotton goods. So these samples that you can see here, which are not drawings, but actual samples of cloth, are taken from an extraordinary collection of volumes. This is 18 volumes that were put together in 1866 by John Forbes Watson in Britain. And they were basically, he called these things industrial museums, because they catalogued the rich variety of Indian textiles precisely with the intention of helping British entrepreneurs to mechanically reproduce them in their factories. So they were basically samples with which people could work to try to reproduce by machine these hand-produced textiles of India. So these volumes then blatantly reveal imperial economic intent. This was this intent to capture the Indian popular market for cotton goods. But they also, of course, captured the extraordinary diversity and sophistication of Indian textiles at that time and designs, with the incredible range of color combinations and decorative techniques, from weaving and block printing to ikat, embroidery, brocade, and so forth. And of course, today, you know, people, many Indian designers, in fact, turn to these volumes as an extraordinary repertoire of design ideas that might link one back to one's heritage. So they now operate in a quite, in a different way. So when Gandhi began experimenting with hand weaving in South Africa, there were already nationalists in India who were deriding the devastating effects of colonial textile trade on the weaving castes in India, many of whom were desperately poor, were unemployed, and in some cases starving as a result. So what was unique about Gandhi's contribution to these debates was that he sought not only a rejection of European cloth, but also a rejection of the mechanization process by which most Indian yarn was being produced, in favor of trying to recreate a self-sustaining village-based textile economy based entirely on hand labor and including hand spinning, crucially. Furthermore, he sought to convey his message by publicly stripping away his European dress in favor of simple Indian homespun garments. And he was extremely aware of the power of his image as it was reproduced. So, you know, it's very interesting to see that this image was taken at the leaving party for him in South Africa at the end of 1914. And you can see he's still wearing a European suit. But look what he's wearing when he arrives off the boat in India in January 1915. He's clearly ordered a set of clothing for this, and he's dramatically staging his dismissal of what he called the tinsel splendors of Western civilization, the superficiality of these splendors, by appearing in what he called the dress of a Gujarati peasant, although probably in reality a Gujarati peasant would not have been wearing precisely that. Looking back at these images, it's easy to miss the extraordinary impact that this gesture would have had at that time. Many who greeted him in Bombay, now Mumbai, perceived him as a cranky weirdo. I mean, the publicity was very strange. The reception was very strange in relation to this. And if we look at an image of the Congress Party in 1919, it reminds us that respectable, educated Indian men in public life were wearing predominantly Western styles or very Westernized Indian styles, whilst retaining specific markers of their community affiliation through their headwear. And you can see this if we look up a little bit more closely at the same image. So Gandhi's identification with the Gujarati peasantry in 1915 was a shock, particularly since he was not from a peasant family, and because rural activities were generally looked down upon by the educated classes. But it was precisely these negative associations of backwardness that Gandhi was extremely anxious to challenge. Not only was he convinced of the inadequacy of European dress to represent Indian interests, But he was also keen to develop and promote a new Indian national dress, which might relate to the rural majority rather than the elite, literate, westernized minority. And it's here we see his concern for social design, where collective welfare is put before concerns with profit or individual interests or status concerns. You know, this is not about conspicuous consumption. So whilst earlier economic nationalists had been content that people could wear whatever they wanted, really, as long as the cloth was made in India, you know, what counted for them was that it was Indian made, Gandhi began to argue that the only cloth that could truly symbolize India's freedom and self-sufficiency had to be hand-woven using pure hand-spun yarn. And he looked to the revival of the spinning wheel as the cornerstone of the revival of the Indian rural economy. Now, this casual craft, which had been performed mainly by women in their homes, was virtually extinct in many areas. And Gandhi tells us that he had considerable difficulty in actually finding someone who could teach him the skill, which gives us an idea of the extent to which machine spinning had taken off even in India. In promoting hand spinning, he sought to elevate a simple denigrated task performed by women to an act of sacred significance, capable of bringing about economic sufficiency and spiritual regeneration. The spinning wheel was, he argued, the non-violent weapon with which independence could be attained. But it also represented the state of being independent, for it was a means of bringing employment to rural men and women and reclaiming and reconnecting every aspect of textile production, from the growing of the cotton to the gathering, to its preparation, its spinning, its weaving, and its wearing. So all of these links that had been severed, in a sense, by this colonial trade. And it was also an environmental concern, as it was a means of reducing the damaging and violent effects of machinery to a very bare minimum. Now, by 1918, Gandhi had successfully achieved his objective of wearing clothes that were not only hand-woven, but also hand-spun. So he was wearing what he considered pure hand-spun khadi. And by 1919, he launched the Swadeshi campaign, calling on all Indian men, women, and children to adopt plain white khadi cloth. And tapping into existing anxieties about the alienating effects of foreign clothes, he called on people to burn their foreign cloth, which he described as filthy, defiling, and an outward symbol of India's slavery to the West. So this was very much about the decolonization of the body. And you can see here an invitation to a public burning. And in the bottom, you can see hats stocked up with the solar topi, the hat that in many ways symbolized the British Raj, being put on the top. So huge rallies were held in which collections of foreign cloth and clothes were set alight, and people were encouraged to cleanse themselves by donning simple, white, homespun garment and taking vows of Swadeshi. And he would get people to make written vows to say that they would wear Swadeshi, in some cases till the end of the non-cooperation movement, in some cases for life. So Gandhi's words had weight because he spoke not as a conservative traditionalist rallying against change, but as a modernist who had worn European dress and chosen to reject it and to reject the idea of civilization that it supposedly represented. I can't remember in what year, but I remember there was one moment where somebody asked Gandhi, you know, what do you think of Western civilization? And his answer was, I think it would be a good idea. So to Gandhi, khadi represented not only political struggle, self-sufficiency, and spiritual regeneration, but it also represented the possibility of national unity with the potential to unite rich and poor, rural and urban, women and men, young and old. And it's here that we see him thinking very strategically as a social designer. he realized that in order to perform this unifying function, he needed to find a unifying form. You can see how he's trying to think, how do I create something that can actually bring people together through design? And with almost military precision, he set about trying to establish visual uniformity, recommending that all men, women, and children should wear this white, plain white, undecorated khadi cotton clothes in simple Indian styles, dhotis, shirts, kurtas, pajamas, saris, and so forth, which he defined as India's national dress. So in advocating thick, plain, white, homespun cloth, Gandhi was in effect posing a radical challenge to the social values and aesthetic tastes of his day. Indian textile traditions had always been extremely colourful and varied, particularly for women. And what people wore revealed not only regional diversity, but also differences in wealth, in education, in class, in caste, and in religion. And for example, in rural areas at that time, it would often be possible to detect a person's religion, a person's wealth, caste, and status, and even their place in the life cycle, were they married or single or widowed, etc., from what they were wearing. And Gandhi, in a sense, was overriding this entire visual system by advocating plain white cloth as a socially and morally unifying force that could be worn by women, children, and men of any background, and that elevated the simple dress associated with poverty above the fancy cloth, of the elite or westernized garments. And this preference for white, was also, a really radical idea, particularly for women, because many women associated, in many areas, white clothes were associated with widowhood or with mourning. This was not the typical dress that people were used to wearing. And interestingly, Kasturba Gandhi herself was very resistant to khadi initially, although later she came to absolutely embrace it wholeheartedly. Insights into Gandhi's genius as a designer can also be found when we look at how he approached the problem of headwear. Oh, sorry, this image of women participating in the nationalist struggle. So Gandhi recognized that it was men's turbans and hats that marked out differences in terms of caste or religion or region and occupation. And we saw that in that earlier image of the Congress in 1919. It was still the case with elite men's dress that these markers were distinctive. So he began to think it was necessary to design a national hat, a national topi. And he began to set about this. And it's really, really interesting to look at his reasoning. And I can't quote in full the full narrative that he gives about how he came to choose what he came to choose. But basically, he surveyed all the different types of regional options available in India and settled eventually on the Kashmiri cap as a kind of prototype. And you can see him wearing a Kashmiri cap in one of these images here. But he needed to adapt it. And he set about developing a kind of lighter, foldable version made out of khadi cloth rather than wool. The great benefit, he argued, being that it was cheap, it was portable, it was easily washable. He was always very concerned with hygiene and practicality. And it could also be folded up and put in your pocket. And it could be afforded by anybody, regardless of their age, their gender, their status, or creed. And in doing so, it could promote a sense of unity and a feeling of empathy between people from different backgrounds, as well as creating a very powerful symbol of self-reliance and a challenge to British tastes and values. Now, Gandhi adopted the topi in 1920 when he developed it. And of course, it very soon became known as the Gandhi topi. We can see children wearing it here. With the official launching of the Swadeshi campaign in 1920, khadi and the Gandhi cap and the charkha, the spinning wheel, entered mainstream politics and were accompanied by the mass boycott and burning of foreign cloth, and by the establishment 1 year later of the charkha in the center of the Congress flag. So the power of khadi as a political symbol lay in the fact that since everyone, wore some sort of clothing, then potentially everybody could be drawn into participating in the freedom struggle. And in embracing the dress of the rural poor rather than the privileged minority, It was what we would now call an inclusive design, encouraging the participation of rural people on a mass scale, and also drawing the support of large numbers of women and children who had previously been alienated from participation in mainstream politics. And women were not only encouraged to take Swadeshi vows and join public protests, but also to donate their jewelry for social welfare and political causes, and of course, to spin. So for Gandhi, handspun yarn was imbued with moral virtue. And spinning itself was a patriotic act of prayer, a kind of meditation. And this involved re-educating the elite to identify with the poorest in the land by embarking on the humble act of spinning themselves. And this wasn't always a popular measure. You know, when it was introduced as a measure and a criteria for membership of the Congress Party in 1924, there was a lot of resistance to it. The Bengali poet Rabindranath Tagore, pictured here in this rather faded image, famously commented, "If man is in danger of being stunted by big machines, the danger of him being stunted by small machines should not be lost sight of." He didn't really approve of the kind of repetitive nature of the activity. Neither did he approve actually of the burning of foreign cloth. But for Gandhi, handspun yarn was a moral fiber, and hand spinning became the linchpin of his dreams, not only for how to attain independence, but crucially for how to live a better life and develop a more humane and sustainable society, one that subverted the capitalist system, minimized damage to the environment, and where local interdependencies were paramount. Now, I think this poster is particularly interesting, for in it we see not only a road to Swaraj through peaceful protest and textile manufacture, but we also see Gandhi's vision really of a rural economy based on cooperation, discipline, simplicity, and bodily labor. Now, it's interesting to see that there aren't any women in this picture, and I like to think that this is the artist who has excluded the women, not Gandhi, because Gandhi, in fact, was very keen to involve women and did involve women in the entire process. And as we saw, spinning had traditionally been a woman's activity. So in this image, all of the workers who are engaged in different stages of cotton preparation, they're all wearing Gandhi kurtas, and most of them are wearing Gandhi topis. But significantly, Gandhi himself is not wearing the topi, neither is he wearing the kurta. So why did this great advocate of a national topi discard his own topi in 1921, just, you know, a year and a half or so after its invention? And why did he remove his kurta, settling for what became his iconic outfit of a khadi dhoti and shawl or chadar? To understand this, we need to look at how Gandhi was using his body as some sort of moral index of the state of the proto-nation, and how he intended the sight of his perceived nakedness actually to shock people into action, in particular into the action of spinning more yarn, weaving more cloth, and wearing more khadi. So just as in later life, through fasting, he used his body, you know, in a way to try to trigger people to stop fighting during the communal riots between Hindus and Muslims. So by adopting the dhoti and abandoning his topi and kurta, he was trying to promote actions in others. And this is something that one only realizes if one goes right back to what he was writing and speaking about at that moment. And he wrote about it literally, you know, the night before adopting the loincloth and immediately afterwards. So from his writings at the time, it's clear that he did not want people to naturalize his nakedness and accept it as inevitable. He wanted them to be shocked by it because it represented the nakedness to which the Indian poor had been reduced. And it also represented the moral duty of all to spin and to weave and to produce more khadi so that both he and the poor might be clothed more adequately in the future. And if the dhoti was intended to provoke people to work harder and to produce more khadi and to reclothe the people, it also functioned, of course, as a reminder of the poverty to which India had been reduced under colonial rule. So what is interesting is that initially it was a temporary measure intended to last only a month and a half, but it became a permanent feature of his identity, partly, no doubt, because India's textile needs were never entirely met through khadi production, something which pained him greatly. I want the reader to measure from this the agony of my soul, he wrote in the Hindu 3 weeks after adopting the dhoti. I do wish that they may understand that Swadeshi means everything. And whilst initial reactions to his reduction in dress were characterized by shock and bemusement, and in some cases ridicule, this was an image in the Hindi Punch at the time, girding his loins to mop up civilization. Later, his new mode of dress sort of became accepted and even, I would say, naturalized. And many saw it as the garb of a Hindu aesthetic or holy man, and which is how he was, of course, regarded by many. And here you can see that sense of him being sort of put up in a pedestal with this absolute sea of people around him in Gandhi caps. And you can see the incredible power of this sort of visual landscape that he's created. Now, Gandhi himself rejected the title of Mahatma and the identity of a holy man. And yet it was precisely the sort of veneration and holiness with which he was seen that meant that he was actually able to sort of address crowds of women directly at a time when normally women would be expected to veil in front of in the presence of a man. So he kind of overrode that as well. Now, if Gandhi never did put on more clothes, it was partly because his khadi mission was never entirely fulfilled. And as India gained independence in 1947, he was not out celebrating with the crowds, but was sitting on the ground quietly, spinning for his own particular vision of India's future. Now, after 1947, many of those who had worn and supported khadi during the freedom struggle abandoned it. And the model of development favored by Prime Minister Nehru, and indeed by subsequent prime ministers ever since, has been one of modernization and technological innovation, in which Gandhian ideas have often been treated as somewhat marginal to the pursuit of progress. Not by all, I know, but in the more general scheme of things. So what I want to ask in this final few moments really is to think about what we can learn from this kind of whirlwind revisiting of the past, and what elements of this Gandhian legacy might be relevant to the present and future. It seems to me that there is a double legacy here. On the one hand, we have the legacy of Gandhi's mastery of political symbolism and his elevation of khadi cloth as being infused with social, moral, and political force. A force which many political leaders have over the years continued to harness, even if they do not always pursue Gandhi's economic model or his philosophy. And as a result, the khadi worn by generations of politicians has often been called into questions, especially by cartoonists. You can see this one here. You know, your khadi outfit looks very patriotic, but make sure they don't notice your Italian shoes, your Japanese socks, and your American underwear. And this is an image that was produced by Mario maybe 15, 20 years ago. But the fact that people try to hold political leaders to account through questioning whether they are living up to the high standards that khadi represents is in many ways proof of the ongoing moral resonance of the fabric and the expectations of simplicity, integrity, and social concern that are associated with it. Many political leaders are selective in which aspects of Gandhi's legacy they embrace. The current Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, has, for example, popularized the wearing of khadi in considerable ways, and he has even put measures in place to support its production and consumption by encouraging its use in railway sleepers, in Air India uniforms, and in paramilitary uniforms, and by promoting contracts with the KVIC, the Khadi and Village Industries Commission. At the same time, he's been criticized for wearing a foreign-made pinstriped suit on his trip to the United States in 2015 to meet President Obama, which was emblazoned with his own name and cost 1 million rupees, a gesture which clearly set him at odds from the Gandhian ideals of simplicity and self-reliance. But what is clear is that there are multiple ways in which Khadi has entered the language of politics, both as a means of representing authority and kind of embodying nationalism, and as a means of critiquing authority. So Khadi has long been co-opted by artists, by social activists, by left-wing academics as a garment of political critique and one which signals some sort of political autonomy. 10 years ago, of course, we saw an extraordinary resurgence of the Gandhi topi in politics when it was adopted by Anna Hazare in 2011 during his anti-corruption campaign, and popularized in the streets in mass rallies conducted using the visual language and techniques of the freedom struggle. All of these examples constitute what I would call the political legacy of Gandhi's elevation of Khadi as a moral fiber imbued with a particular history, ethics, and power. But there's also another side to Gandhi's legacy as a social designer. Whilst for decades, many of his ideas about self-sufficiency, voluntary simplicity, the value of hand labor, and environmental sustainability may have seemed out of kilter with some of the technological modernizing path that India took. But today, that can no longer be said to be the case. What is clear as we enter the third decade of the 21st century is the extreme relevance of his ideas as we face many of the major global challenges of our times: building environmental sustainability, tackling global poverty and underdevelopment, valuing natural resources and returning to more sustainable levels of production and consumption and more viable local models of interdependence. In many ways, India is well placed to lead the way in tackling many of these challenges. And there are many inspiring examples in India which we might look to, which draw on a Gandhian legacy in creative ways. And I'm aware that there's quite a tradition of this. But one of these, of course, is the area of ethical fashion, relevant, I think, at your institute. I see, for example, that in January 2019 in Ahmedabad, there was a 2-day international conference on sustainable textiles entitled A Way Ahead, Ethical Khadi, which brought together a number of experts on different elements of India's rich textile heritage, many of them drawing on Gandhian ideas about localizing production in rural areas, expanding employment through craft production, and building environmentally sustainable businesses through cooperation with local artisans. And amongst the participants at this conference was Uzra Uzrama, as she is often known, the founder of the decentralized Cotton Yarn Trust and of Malka, and I had the pleasure of meeting her and hearing about her work some years back. Now, Uzrama has since 1990 been advocating and putting into practice a Gandhian model of modernization based on developing vernacular cloth production at a local level in Andhra Pradesh, restoring those interdependencies between cotton farmers, ginners, spinners, dyers, weavers, and wearers of handcrafted textiles. And such enterprises offer really inspiring models, I think, of less hierarchic relations of production that are outside the control of market and capital, and where the idea of ethical fashion is built literally into every stage of the process. Meanwhile, there's an increasing number of fashion designers who advocate the use of khadi as an eco-friendly fabric, which leaves zero carbon footprint, uses very little water in the production process, and is both environmentally sustainable as well as being, connected to Indian heritage. We can think of big fashion names like Ritu Berry, who only uses khadi in her collections. And we can also think of, other companies springing up. This one that I only came across through the internet, Khadi Cotton, founded in West Bengal in 2014, utilizing the skills of local artisans and exporting hand-spun cotton goods around the world. And of course, there are many such examples, and I am utterly aware that you will be far more in touch with those than I am sitting here in London. But we can also think of interesting new technological developments, such as the e-Charka, developed by engineer R.S. Hiramath as a tool designed to provide work, income, and electricity in remote rural areas. It consists of a sort of hand-operated spinning wheel attached to a very low load generator. 1 hour of spinning produces electricity to generate 3 hours of light and radio transmission. And I cannot help but thinking that such an invention would appeal to Gandhi, who was always a keen experimenter, and never more so when it came to developing socially relevant solutions beneficial to generating employment and improving the lives and well-being of the rural poor. So what I hope to have done in this lecture is to offer some additional insights to the many ideas and insights I am sure you already have as to how Gandhi's socially oriented design experiments and thinking might have relevance today. And my final image is indeed a very contemporary one. It consists of 3 khadi face masks, which I purchased this week whilst preparing this lecture, and which remind us, of course, of the flexibility of khadi and the possibility of adapting it to whatever challenges we may face, whether in Pune or in London. And with that, I will end and thank you for listening to my talk. Yeah, do I leave it? Stop sharing.
Thank you, Professor Emma, for wonderful images and inspiring address for a young generation designer as well as for all of us, with wonderful visuals and with appropriate narration. You have started with Gandhiji's icon with Charkha and ended with Hiramath's machine khadi of Charkha. So thanks for being with us. There are some questions asked. So I just request Professor Prasanna Halbe, head of the department, product design department, Symbiosis Institute of Design, for vote of thanks and questions. So over to you, Prasanna. Thank you,
Nitin. Thank you, Nitin. And thanks a lot, Professor Emma. It was a beautiful thought given by you. Okay, and what we thought that, being in India also, we do not have that much of research about Gandhiji, what you have done while you were here, and you are still continuing that thing. That was something amazing. We have received 3 questions, which I will be putting so that you can answer in your own way. So the first question is asked by Apurva. She says, being a teacher, how can I alter the changing attitude of students towards their studies, their goals, and the country? I will repeat, being a teacher, how can I alter the changing attitude of students towards their studies, goal, and the country?
Oh, it's a very interesting question. I mean, I think, as teachers, we need to try to inspire our students. And one way of doing that is also through, if we do research, sharing that research. But I think one of the things when you're teaching about history, it's so easy for people to look back at it as sort of boring old stuff from their contemporary perspective, young people. And what I would try to do is to really generate a sense of, this was really radical in the time, put yourself in the position of being here and imagine yourself into that. And that is an interesting way of kind of making people connect more to a heritage or to a history, at a more personal level. They need to do that kind of imaginative leap in a sense. And Gandhi was amazing at doing imaginative leaps. He was imagining this. It was his capacity to sort of think psychologically in many ways that was so incredibly powerful.
Okay, thank you. Then we have second question that says, Gandhiji was a master communicator, being also a great designer. Would you like to throw on some light related to the non-verbal communication he used to have?
Well, yes, I mean, I think his body, the way in which he used his body and his whole sort of, was communicating in a sense without words. And it's quite interesting, the relationship between words and image with Gandhi, because I found that when I was doing research, particularly about the moment where he decides to take off the topi and take off, there's a sort of discrepancy between how people were perceiving it and what he was trying to convey with it. He didn't want, as I was trying to say in the lecture, he didn't want people to just think, oh yeah, fine. He wanted people to think, oh, we must do something about this. He should not be so naked, kind of thing. And I think that interactive element was really interesting. But I think there's another side to it, which is that, levels of literacy in those days in rural areas were quite low, and simply by appearing in a particular way and making a connection through the language he used, through the way in which he dressed, he could, break down barriers in a sense, because the clothing that the westernized elite were wearing in that time would have been extremely alienating to your person in a rural village in India. And he broke down those barriers through his own bodily appearance. So yes, that visual communication was really, really important element of what he was doing.
That question was actually asked by Suvarna Patil. Now we have last question, and that is asked by Asha Kulkarni. She is asking whether is the khadi still or khadi is popular in Western countries too?
Yes, I mean, when it is, and it's really interesting. I was looking, in preparing this talk, I was also looking partly on websites, because we can't actually go out in London. We're still in lockdown here. But I noticed in New York there's a Japanese designer who's got an exhibition of khadi clothing at the time, and they've definitely a love of I mean, not everybody, of course, but there is increasingly this desire for kind of, organic things and hand-produced things. And so, yes, I think, that there is a market for khadi, and also a love of that aesthetic and simplicity. And I myself, when I was a student in India, I always bought, beautiful, plain, thick spun khadi, not white, different colors, and I just had a whole series of kurtas made in different colors, and I lived in that, and I loved it, and so yes, I think there is definitely a love of that.
Thank you for answering these questions.
Can I say something, please? Can I please say something?
Nitin, do we
Is this time?
have you are on
I just
mute,
want to
Nitin.
share. Can I share something?
Yeah, ma'am, within 2 minutes, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Emma, thank you so much. That was very interesting. I want to share a little information and a family story. When you said that Mahatma Gandhi had a difficult time to locate spinners, that's true. But he had a difficult time in Gujarat. And later he says that he didn't know that the women of Punjab were spinning.
Yeah.
That would have made his work easier.
Yeah.
And that point, I would like to link up with a family story. My mother is now 90 years old, and she remembers her mother spinning on the charkha, the traditional charkha, and that yarn was picked up from the house by a weaver. Yeah. It was woven, it was dyed, and brought back to be made into a lawyer's coat, a Western coat. So while we were talking about Western garments and traditional clothing, I just wanted you to have that link between the two.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah. And the other thing is, when you were talking about Anna Hazare's topi, this is something, since this talk is happening in Pune in Maharashtra, I would just like to ask, the teachers of Symbiosis, is this a Maharashtrian topi as well? Because you see many people in Maharashtra wearing the similar topi.
Yes,
I don't know. I mean,
it is. Sorry.
So all I know is that when Gandhi was sort of designing that topi, he sort of used the Kashmiri topi as his prototype, he says. But of course, there are, there's such a variety of headwears in India that it's not impossible that something very similar, already existed.
Yes, thank you for sharing, Sudhana. Yeah, over to Prasanna again.
Yeah, thank you, Nitin, once again. Now, it brings me to the vote of thanks. I would like to, first of all, thank Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute, New Delhi, for joining hands with Symbiosis Institute of Design for such a great lecture series on Gandhiji. Of course, thanks are due to Professor Emma Tarlo for delivering such a beautiful thought about Gandhiji, and that too sitting in London. Okay. Thank you to Dr. Prachi Kaul, Director of SICI, for her address. Dr. Sanjeevani Ayachit, Dean, Architecture, Design, Faculty of SIU, and also Director of Symbiosis Institute of Design. Mr. Sachin Dhopate and his whole IT team, SID and SIU IT team, for connecting us all over the India. All coordinators of Symbiosis Institute of Design for registration support. Special thanks to Anandita, our faculty colleague, and her team for handling the media. And lastly, thanks to all the participants for joining for this great lecture. There is one announcement before we conclude. You may join us to celebrate this concept of Gandhiji as a designer, and we will have another talk on Friday, 19th March 2021, and the talk is by Abhijit Randive. He is a freelance writer, editor, and creative head at Pune International Film Festival. And the title of the topic is Gandhi and the Popular Visual Culture in India. The lecture is going to be on 19th March, that is Friday. So don't forget to join this lecture series, and there are many more lectures to come in this series. We'll be contacting you and we'll be sending you the links through our regular contacts. Here I declare that today's session is over, and thank you once again for being there with us for this session. Thanks a lot.